etc. We're just kicking things off now and should be going live. A few minutes, then we'll do a bit of a breakdown. And it looks like we are live. Hey guys, welcome to our Climate Techie Sustainability Series, where we just lost Anders. That's not good. Where we just lost our presenting panelist who's going to be walking us through the EU Fund Taxonomy for climate VCs, impact VCs, investors, LPs, anyone who wants to understand the ins and outs of being an Article 8, Article 9 fund, what it comes down to when it comes down to reporting, environmental considerations, and the ins and outs, so to speak, of having a high value, really impact and sustainability focused fund. If this is your first time here, this is our Climate Techie Sustainability Series brought to you by Forward VC. To find out more about us, visit forward.vc, and to subscribe for upcoming events so that you never miss a thing, forward.vc/eventbrite. We've also got some pretty awesome resources on our website, our 1,000+ climate investor database, where a lot of them are probably Celsia's clients already, as well as our Climate Techies community of 3,000-4,000 folks across Slack and WhatsApp. You can find that at forward.vc/techies to sign up and for more details. The purpose of these series are to bring on experts in different aspects of the climate sustainability side of things. So you can, apologize for the background noise, so you can get a bit deeper in. And today we're focused specifically on investors, although it does play in for founders as well. Anders is here from Celsia. So Celsia, if you guys don't know, they're pretty much the go-to when it comes to EU Fund Taxonomy software and services. We've got a special offer set up for you guys, 20% off at forward.vc/Celsia, CELSIA. But enough of that. I wanted to welcome Anders to the program, and he's going to be breaking down the fund taxonomy and what we need to know if you want to have those high value fund LPs. Anders, welcome to the program.
Thanks a lot, Matt. It's a pleasure being here.
So it's a really big and heavy topic, so you put together a presentation to make it a little bit easier. You wanna share your screen and share a little bit more about kind of the origin of what's been happening and what the direction looks like?
Absolutely. So I can just dive a bit into what I'm going to cover here today. We're going to start a bit on the general side, looking a bit at the SFDR and the EU Taxonomy at a glance, and then dive a bit more into who needs to report, how are these two regulations linked together, and then point 3 here, I think we'll spend the most time on, which is reporting in practice. Actually going in a bit of kind of using a concrete example and seeing how does this work in practice. And then finally on point 4, why report, combined with a Q&A. So that's why it's 2.4, because we'll do that in combination. So I hope you
take it away.
Yeah, thanks. I hope you stay all the way to the end, because I think the why report is also quite important here, going a bit beyond what's just like kind of the regulatory requirements, but also on the advantages, both for the asset manager or investment firm and also for the portfolio companies. Just 2 words about Celsia to start with, so we know a bit where we're coming from. So we are a software provider that makes software to make sustainability management and reporting as efficient as possible for companies. So we have existed for about 2 years now and have, you can see some of our clients there, a small selection of the clients we have here. And we have clients in a bit different parts of Europe and also in North America. Our main office is in Oslo, but we also have offices in both Copenhagen and Berlin as well. So what I will be presenting today is a bit of the experience we have, working with all our clients the last 2 years, both on the taxonomy reporting and also a bit more in general on the SFDR for investment funds. So let's start with a short backdrop here. What are these regulations all about? Why do we
before we even jump into the regulations, what's the carrot? Why is this exciting for fund managers? Start there and then go to the backstory of why this matters, and then we'll get into the deep and heavy.
Absolutely, and I will save some of it for my last part there, which is on the why reporting, but I can share some of it already for now. And I think the first part is just the regulatory aspect, that if you have an Article 8 or Article 9 fund, basically like the light green or the dark green funds, if you provide that, you need to care about this. That's a regulatory requirement. And we'll go a bit more into that now. But also, I think there are value beyond that as well. That I think will be a bit clearer also when we go to the next slide and seeing the EU's motivation for this, because this is very much about being transparent, about transparency. And while being transparent on your sustainability performance, on your fund sustainability performance, it can also become very attractive, we see, for investors. Because we have a lot of LPs that care a lot about sustainability. Again, both from a regulatory requirement side, but also because they have their own internal guidelines for how sustainability should be considered when they're investing. So we see that funds that perform well on sustainability can become very attractive to sustainability-focused investors. So I think that's a bit of kind of the motivation here, and we'll definitely get back to that point as well.
So it's all about attracting the LPs and attracting investment dollars into funds that truly matter and are doing big things.
Absolutely. I think it's also a bit beyond that as well, because it's also about working with the portfolio companies in a way that also provides value to them. So this is not just a reporting exercise for the portfolio companies as well, and they also get some value from it, and they become future fit and ready both for the regulatory requirements they will face in the future, but also to become attractive also to other investors as well.
Awesome, and I apologize for interrupting you. Now take it away. What's the backdrop? What's the backstory?
No, but this is a very good question. Thanks for bringing it up. I think that's the key motivation for caring about this at all.
And for folks that are listening, you'll have a chance to ask questions at the end, or just type them into the chat, and we'll bring them up as they go along.
Good. And then let's ask a bit there, and I'd look a little bit into what were the motivations here. Why does these regulations exist at all? And some of the challenges you see on the left-hand side here of the slide, which is really the motivation for EU on imposing these regulations. There was a risk of greenwashing based on the fact that there were no common definition of what's actually a sustainable investment. What is sustainable? So when companies and investors want to place their money in a sustainable company, previously there existed no common definition of what's actually sustainable. And that made it very hard to also compare companies. How to compare companies from different industries, what's actually sustainable and not. And a big lack here of transparency. And I think a good symptom of this is that the MIT Sloan School of Management, they performed a study, and they saw that ESG ratings between different rating agencies, they correlated with about 61%. And to compare it to mainstream credit ratings, those correlate with about 99%, which means that if you ask two rating agencies what is actually a sustainable company, you'll probably get two very different answers. And the point there is not that the rating agencies have been doing a particularly bad job here on sustainability ratings. The point is that it's been so hard to compare companies. So these taxonomy regulation and sustainable finance disclosure regulation, those are a part of EU's action plan on sustainable finance to increase this transparency. I think what's quite interesting with both these regulations that they're not imposing like hard requirements for companies to change. They don't require a company to cut emissions or imposing specific measures to become more aware of biodiversity and so on, but it requires you to report on it, making it transparent what you're doing and what you're not doing. And taxonomy regulation, very put in brief, is a classification system. It classifies companies as green or not, very simply put it, based on how they comply with a set of criteria related to the activities they're doing. We will return back to this in much more detail, but just to put it out there already now. The SFDR applies to the investor side of it. So the investors need to disclose data on their portfolios. And these two regulations, those are separate regulations, but they also interact a bit in the way that the taxonomy regulation also applies to investment firms, also now very big investment firms. So a normal, smaller VC, for instance, will not be hit directly by the taxonomy regulation and the requirements there. However, the SFDR, that also applies to the financial products, the funds that are offered. So that means that if you offer an Article 8 or 9 fund, then you will be subject to the SFDR. And the disclosure requirements there. And in those disclosure requirements is also a link back to the taxonomy regulation that you need to disclose taxonomy performance of your portfolio. So despite being different regulations, they're also very much interlinked through this link between, in specific, the product disclosures under the SFDR that points at the taxonomy regulation. And that we're also going to cover now in the next slides. So as I've already mentioned, you have this classification in the SFDR. There are three main categories of funds.
Super.
And these main categories are the Article 6 funds, Article 8, and Article 9. And for Article 6, you don't really consider sustainability factors when investing. And then also the disclosure requirements are quite low. But I think what's interesting here is really the Article 8 and Article 9 funds, often referred to as light green and dark green funds. So the Article 8 funds, they promote environmental and social characteristics. You don't say that the whole objective with the investment is sustainable investments, but you promote those characteristics. They're kind of light green. Article 9 funds, those on the other hand, they will have sustainable investments as objective. So they are often referred to as dark green funds. And they also have a bit different sets of disclosure requirements attached to them. And what you need to disclose under these regulations, under these different classification series, is taxonomy alignment as one point, and also a lot of additional requirements relating to principal adverse impact indicators, as you might know, these PAI indicators, and you also have additional sustainability indicators. So there's quite much here in the scope that you need to disclose if you are providing Article 8 or 9 funds.
One quick jump-in question. When does it make sense for a fund to go for Article 8 or 9 status? Is there a specific kind of assets under management where prior to that, all the regulation and red tape doesn't make sense, and after that, it's worth it from an LP and assets under management perspective?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it's, as we see so far, size is not necessarily decisive for when it makes sense. We are working with some quite small investment firms among our clients that offer Article 8 funds, for instance. So I would rather say it is rather how we want to position the fund and what you want to focus on. You can have a very small fund with only just a couple of investments that could make sense to classify as Article 8, for instance, or Article 9 even. So I don't think there is really kind of a limit there for when it makes sense. I think you need to start in the other end and look what is going to be the objective of this fund, and then start in that end.
Know if there was a cutoff for kind of the amount of red tape and paperwork that went into it. So a certain size fund, it wouldn't make sense. But as you were going after larger and institutional LPs, maybe it had more of an unlock from an LP perspective. Yeah, no, and I think it's a very fair question. It could be that like if you are in a very small fund, that it can kind of the disclosure requirements are large enough that you can say it doesn't make sense. But I think still there are very effective ways to work with these disclosure requirements. I think those shouldn't really be stopping you if you want to have a focus on sustainable investments in the fund. So I wouldn't say there is a real limit there. Okay, so just to narrow down the scope a bit, because we could probably talk about this for a full day, because there's quite many different aspects of these disclosures. And what we're going to focus on today is taxonomy alignment reporting, which you can see is relevant for Article 8 and Article 9 funds. And what I want to do now is first to look a bit at when does this become relevant? Does all Article 9 funds Article 8 and 9 funds need to disclose in taxonomy, or is it just some of them? So we made some decision trees, and this is a bit of a busy slide, but as you can see here, we can kind of shift the focus to the right-hand side of this slide. If you have an Article 8 fund that promotes environmental characteristics, then you need to calculate and disclose on the share of taxonomy-aligned investments. If you only promote social characteristics, then you don't need to care about disclosing on the taxonomy there. So that's really kind of the rule of thumb for the Article 8 funds. And that means that even if you have indicated in your pre-contractual disclosures that, okay,
we are making 0% taxonomy aligned investments. You still need to actually calculate the real share and disclose that to the investors in the end in your periodic disclosures. And just to also jump here to the Article 9, a bit similar. I think the biggest difference here is that in addition, like of course, if you have an environmental objective, you need to disclose on taxonomy, but also if you have a social objective, but you happen to make investments which are contributing to an environmental objective. So basically are making investments in companies that are performing taxonomy activities. Then you also need to report on taxonomy. So what we see here in practice is that if you are offering an Article 8 or 9 fund, and you have an environmental objective, you will need to disclose in either case on taxonomy. And for Article 9, it's even stricter. So this is very relevant for very many funds. As we see now in the EU, there's a very big proportion of the funds offered in the EU now are Article 8 and 9 funds.
Do you know what the percentages are?
It's varying a bit, but I think the latest now is a bit, I think it was around 60% or something, Article 8 and 9. Morningstar, they come with like these quarterly updates. So I think that's, but that I can check up in the latest Morningstar report. But I think it's around 60% or something, Article 8 and 9. So it's a quite big proportion of the funds offered in the EU.
Devil's advocate question: if everyone is getting certified as an Article 8 or 9 fund, does it ultimately kind of take away of the value of the Article 8 or 9 fund? It's kind of like the argument of everyone one-upping each other. There's nothing left to one-up.
Yes, I mean, this is a very fair question to ask. And I think that question is particularly relevant, I think, for the Article 8, which is really like the biggest group here of the two of them. If Article 8 has kind of become this big category that everyone can be able to fit in somehow. And I think we'll see a bit. I think some investors or asset managers, they take a very active stance and say, okay, then we upgrade kind of to Article 9 to distinguish ourselves from this bigger group of Article 8 that seems to be kind of fitting in a lot of different funds. I think that could be like one development, that more companies actually want to offer Article 9 to distinguish themselves even clearer. I think another development could also be that there will be more guidance from the EU there on exactly how to fit into this Article 8 label, because now it's quite open, it's quite free to kind of fit in there. But there have been several suggestions, I know, from different stakeholders in making some stricter criteria. For instance, saying that you need a minimum proportion of sustainable investments to qualify as Article 8. But
do you know what the breakdown is between 8 and 9 in terms of percentages? Just
it's a good question. I think it's I think Article 9 is probably, we should be a bit careful giving numbers here because I don't have the latest numbers in front of me. And this has also been varying quite much because there's been like trends of upgrades and downgrades going through the quarters. But there's a significantly bigger part that are Article 8 than 9.
Okay.
Article 8 is definitely dominating compared to Article 9.
Okay. And folks, while Anders goes further with the presentation, just post in here kind of who you are and what your role is. Are you at a fund? Are you with an LP? Are you a startup? So we know a little bit more about the audience and can tailor the program as we go. Take it away, Anders.
Thank you. So the main intention, I think, with the two slides I show now is just to kind of really highlight that it's very relevant for Article 8 and 9 to care about taxonomy due to regulatory requirements here. And I think we talk about, okay, disclosing on taxonomy. What does that actually mean? Now we're going to zoom a bit in there and see what does this mean in practice. And for the first part now, I just want us to forget a bit kind of the investor perspective. Now let's just think about a normal non-financial company. It could be an industry company, for instance, and what they are actually disclosing when it comes to taxonomy. So the main three KPIs non-financial company is disclosing under the taxonomy are the ones you see here. So it's turnover, OPEX, and CAPEX, and you disclose the eligibility and alignment proportions of each of those. And what that means in practice is eligibility is the proportion of the financials that are associated with activities defined under the taxonomy. So the activities defines a lot of activities. An activity can be manufacture of hydrogen. It could be road transport. It could be something in energy, for instance, energy production or electricity production from wind power. So these are all activities that are defined under the taxonomy. And the eligibility proportion here is, for instance, if we go to turnover, how many % of my turnover is eligible under the taxonomy? Is coming from an activity that is defined under the taxonomy. So if, for instance, I'm a company, I get 75% of my turnover from wind power, I own wind parks, but I also get 25% of, for instance, an oil and gas activity that's not defined in the taxonomy. Then I would disclose an eligibility percentage of 75%.
It sounds like a nightmare for companies and for portfolio companies.
Well, it might seem a bit complex, I think, when like looking at the top down. But what we'll see now when we go into the more kind of bottom up approach and how to deal with this in practice is that it's actually possible to deal with. Like it's not as hard as it might look at the first glance, I think. And also I think the eligibility is one part, but alignment is actually like the most important here, and in particular for investors, I think, because the alignment is similar as the eligibility. It's related to the financials associated with taxonomy activities, but it's also that you're not only included, you're not only doing activities defined under taxonomy, but you're also aligned with the criteria defined for that activity or those activities under the taxonomy. So going back to my example, say that, okay, I get 75% of my revenue, my turnover from my wind parks that I operate. And in like out of the total turnover, 50% is from these wind parks, and it's also aligned with the criteria that the taxonomy defines for wind power. Then my alignment percentage is 50%. So that is, I get 50% of my total turnover in considering all my activities from an activity or activities that are aligned with the criteria under the taxonomy. So the alignment percentage, of course, will always be lower or equal to the eligibility percentage, because it's kind of I would say a stricter measurement in the way that, okay, you're both defined in the taxonomy as an activity and you are aligned with the criteria there. So this is really the three main KPIs a normal industry company or a normal non-financial company discloses on. So for an investor, how this would look like is that this will of course be a bit different for an investor that doesn't like perform these taxonomy activities themselves, but rather invest in companies that perform the activities. So the way this work is practiced is that an investor or a fund's alignment percentage is the weighted average alignment of the different portfolio companies they invested in. So as you can see here in an example, okay, I'm invested in one company that has 40% aligned turnover, for instance. Then one that has 84. Then I will aggregate all of these up, weighting it with the market value of my investment in each of these portfolio companies, and then aggregating it up on a fund level. And I can then disclose on all these indicators. So I disclose them separately. I say, okay, on the turnover indicator, I have a 40% alignment, for instance, based on the weighted average of all this. On OPEX, perhaps I have 35% or something else. So it's based on the weighted average of how my portfolio companies are doing it. So that means if you are investing in portfolio companies that are doing a lot of activities defined under taxonomy and are also aligned with the criteria there, you will most likely have a very high alignment score as a fund. So this is really kind of the top-down way of looking at it. And as I think you pointed out something important, Matt, I think for many this looks quite complex when looking at it in this top-down approach. So now let's go a bit more into detail on it. Let's see how does this work in practice when a company, and then we can start all the way on the top when an investor wants to disclose taxonomy alignment for a portfolio. How is this done in practice? So these are really the 6 main steps that we normally see companies do and we normally perform when working with companies on this. First step on the investor side is to get an overview of the portfolio companies. If none of the companies are performing any activities eligible in the taxonomy at all, is quite easy, because then, of course, the alignment would be 0, because none of them are even performing a taxonomy activity. So then you can kind of screen out perhaps some companies that you know are not performing any taxonomy activities before moving on to the next step. And next step is really where the portfolio company also need to do some work, because then they would need to screen themselves by first structuring the company, then matching each part of the company with taxonomy activities and the financial data, assess the activities against technical screening criteria to calculate these alignment scores. And then on the investor side, like the step 5 and 6 are rather simple then, or at least 5, which is just aggregating, weighting it with the investment in each company. And then step 6, which is reporting on it. So now we're going to go a bit more in depth on each of these steps. It might become a little bit technical here, but we're trying to make it as kind of tangible as possible, so we see how is this done in practice. So let's start with step 1. Normally, how we see investors are doing it, or asset managers are doing this, is that they start by looking just at all companies. So if you look at Fund A now, we can already identify, perhaps we have some companies we know are performing at least one activity defined in the taxonomy. Then those will be interesting in bringing into the next round. But perhaps you already here identify that many of the companies are not doing any activities defined in the taxonomy. Then we don't need to bother them. Perhaps we can check with them, like, okay, and verify that this is really true, that you are definitely not doing any of the activities defined under the taxonomy. But if that's true, there's no point in kind of bringing them into a more detailed screening, because there will be nothing there to screen for them when it comes to alignment. So after this first step, we will now zoom a bit into one of the companies and see how does it work in practice for one company. And this is like a made-up company, just to show in this example, which we call HydroSafe, which we know is at least doing the activity hydrogen production. So those are relevant to screen further here for alignment. Okay, so let's now zoom into HydroSafe's part. So HydroSafe, they have 3 different factories. One in Malmö, one in Stuttgart, and one in Oslo. And in Malmö, they're producing hydrogen from electrolysis, plus producing ammonia from some of this hydrogen. In Stuttgart, they're producing hydrogen directly from natural gas, no carbon capture or storage, just normal hydrogen production from natural gas. And in the Oslo factory, they're producing propane gas for the consumer market. So this is my company. And what they will now do from HydroSafe's perspective is to identify any taxonomy activities they're doing. So this is basically take the list of taxonomy activities, like the activities the taxonomy include, and compare it to what my company is doing. So what I would end up doing in this situation for HydroSafe is that, okay, in Malmö, I know I do manufacture hydrogen. That's a taxonomy activity. I also do manufacture of anhydrous ammonia, which is also a taxonomy activity. And in the Stuttgart factory, I'm doing manufacture of hydrogen. In factory number 3 in Oslo, we're doing production of propane gas, which is not defined as any taxonomy activity, and no of the other activities I'm doing there are defined under taxonomy either. So here I just know that, okay, no relevant taxonomy activities in that side. This is really the first step here, defining that taxonomy activity. And then the next step is to allocate the financial data to each of these activities. Basically meaning indicating turnover, OPEX and CAPEX, going or associated with each of these activities on each site. This could be a little bit tricky, because sometimes these financial numbers are not already kind of in the accounting system defined under, like, associated with a specific activity. Perhaps they're just associated with kind of the output product. But this is the exercise you need to go through here. And the 2 steps we've done now, as you might have seen or might have observed, is actually like now we have already done what's needed to calculate the eligibility proportion. So if I just want to disclose my eligibility score as a company, I've already done the work now. I found the activities and I have allocated the financial numbers. But we want to continue all the way to actually calculating alignment score for HydroSafe. So let's move on. And the next step here is to assess against the technical screening criteria. That means that for each taxonomy activity, for each of HydroSafe's sites or different reporting units, they need to screen activity against the criteria defined by the taxonomy. And here I just included some example criteria, as you can see. And also to use a bit of the taxonomy terminology here, you need to make a substantial contribution to at least one of the environmental objectives defined in the taxonomy, and also do no significant harm to the others. What this means in practice is just that you are exposed to a set of criteria that you need to comply with here. So the substantial contribution criteria are often a little bit stricter in one way, or those are often, but not always, but sometimes a bit stricter because they're relating to actually doing a contribution to an environmental objective. While do no significant harm is, as the name indicates, about avoiding any harm. So in practice for this activity, manufacture of hydrogen, one of the substantial contribution criteria is that the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions for the hydrogen is less than 3 tons of CO2 equivalents per ton of hydrogen produced. So this is the criteria they need to comply with if they are ordered to be aligned on this activity. Similarly, do no significant harm criteria, they need to have performed a physical climate risk assessment and also implemented or planned at least any mitigating measures.
Are there any upsides for companies for complying with all of these different taxonomies and regulations? So what's the motivation for companies? Other than the sustainability side of things, is there any other extra carrot?
Yes. So now I assume that you're referring here to, as we look at now, like a non-financial company, a normal company, to put it that way. And as you mentioned, there are, of course, the regulatory requirements that apply mainly to the bigger companies. But we also see that there's a lot of smaller companies that are do not need by regulatory measures to disclose in taxonomy, that still want to disclose in it and still want to comply with the criteria. And there could be different motivations for that. And one of them could be, for instance, that their customers are pushing for it. When we know, we have been working with companies where they like the motivation for doing this is actually because the customers have started asking for it. Is the product that you supply us actually taxonomy aligned? Or is it coming from a taxonomy aligned activity? Similarly, we also know that this is also quite important with access to capital that we will touch a bit on later. Both, of course, to be attractive to investors that themselves need to report on taxonomy scores for their portfolio, but also when it comes to the banks and green loans. We see that many banks are now taking in the EU taxonomy in their green loans framework, which means that if you are, if for instance want to finance a project and it is taxonomy aligned, you often qualify then for a green loan, which has a lower interest rate than a non-green loan. So the difference there in interest rates is not huge at the moment, but we expect them to go up. And we know it's an expectation from many banks that in the future it will be quite hard. It will be like the coin will be flipped a bit the other way around, that it will be quite hard to get finance to a project that you cannot prove is sustainable. And being taxonomy aligned is a very good way of proving that you are sustainable, because these criteria are quite strict. For most activities, they're very strict. For instance, this criteria looking on here on the requirements for hydrogen, you're not going to be able to meet that unless you're either doing carbon capture and storage on the process if you produce from natural gas, or you produce it as green hydrogen using sustainable electricity and using electrolysis.
That's part of what I meant as well. So I feel like in some way that I think a lot of what the EU is doing with regulations and getting more disclosure is very important. But I also feel like certain things are overdoing it, or only labeling kind of green hydrogen as green versus all other forms of hydrogen. Like, it seems idealistic, but not achievable.
Well, I think on one hand you can say it's idealistic, but it's actually what is required. Like the way many of these criteria has been calculated is that you started with the EU goal of becoming climate neutral by 2050, and then you kind of calculated backwards, like what kind of electricity mix do we need then to reach that goal? What kind of criteria do we need to put there? So I think this is very much science-based from the EU side, these criteria, and that means that they are strict. But I think that's also a good way for actually differentiating the companies that are actually doing a sustainable activity from the ones that are doing something that's not very sustainable and cannot be part of a kind of a 2050 mix.
I get it. It kind of feels like Germany shutting off its nuclear plants to be idealistic and then having to backtrack because idealism has to also fit with realism and impact. That's just kind of my perspective when it gets too deep into the weeds. But anyways, I'll let you continue.
Yeah, no, but I think it's definitely a point there. But I think also here, what's ideal and what's kind of realistic, I think could also kind of approach a bit here, because we see that if this becomes the tool that the EU wants it to become, that for instance, when it comes to green financing, it will be easier to get it if you have a taxonomy aligned project. That will be a huge incentive to actually make the projects taxonomy aligned and complying with these very, very strict criteria. So I think it's yes, it is. It might seem strict, but I think it's very much needed, and it's also could be a very good way of pushing companies to doing it, being very ambitious.
Fair point. Fair point.
On the last point here on the minimum social safeguards, I think that's also an important aspect of the taxonomy, that you need to also comply with a minimum set of minimum social safeguards, which is basically that you need to make sure that both your own workers are treated well, that you don't commit any human rights violations in your supply chain, and so on. So it's basically complying with the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and also the UN guiding principles for business and human rights. This is also an important part of the taxonomy. I think is often a bit kind of neglected when people talk about taxonomy, but it's a very important part of it as well. Okay, let's move on here now. So going back to HydroSafe and looking at the results of this alignment assessment, you can see that, okay, in the factory in Malmö, they were actually able to comply with all these criteria for the activities of both manufacture of anhydrous ammonia and manufacture of hydrogen. The Stuttgart factory did not comply with the substantial contribution criteria and is then not aligned because they had too high life cycle emissions on the hydrogen produced. And as we already talked about, the factory in Oslo is not eligible because it didn't perform an activity that's defined under the taxonomy. So what we've done now is actually sufficient to calculate HydroSafe's taxonomy KPIs. We have assessed activities and allocated the financials to it, and we can now calculate the proportion here of both what's aligned and what is not aligned or not eligible. So we see here that they're about 9.5% aligned on the turnover side. However, we have a quite much higher CapEx alignment. I think that's also one of the advantages, I think, of this way of looking like these KPIs, that you have the turnover that gives a quite good indication of the situation as of now. And then you have the CapEx that says something about what's going to be in the future. So that's, I think, a bit of the benefit of these taxonomy KPIs. Okay, let's move on. Zooming a bit out, this process, we need to do it for all of the portfolio companies that are eligible for any taxonomy activities, and then aggregate it.
Basically, this process is an absolute nightmare. How much time does this normally take investors?
Well, I wouldn't call it a nightmare actually, because it might seem a bit comprehensive, but we see that what investors we work with normally do is that they provide, like, they make the portfolio companies input the data that the portfolio companies have available. So that makes it a couple of hours per portfolio company. But then they have it, then they have what they need. So this of course depends very much on the size of the portfolio company and how many activities that they're doing. So if you are a big company, of course, like doing a lot of activities all across the world, of course, this takes a bit more time. But if you're a small company, perhaps just doing one activity on one site, it's not like the biggest exercise. We have had examples of companies that, as I said, perform the whole screening here in just a couple of hours. So it's definitely possible. But we, of course,
yeah, you, of course, make it probably simpler, faster, and easier, I would imagine.
Yeah, so that's what we want to do, of course, in Celsia. That's our goal, of making this process as simple as possible. We want to give both the investor and, of course, the portfolio companies the tools to do this as efficiently as possible. So we don't have portfolio companies spending like hours going into the regulation and trying to read up and understand everything, because that could be quite complex.
Yeah, major waste of everybody's time. Again, we got 20% discount set up for you guys, just forward.vc/Celsia. When I think you got to the end of the presentation. I wasn't positive though, Anders.
Yes, it's we're approaching the end there.
Folks, if you've got questions, now is time to key them up, because I know this is very technical and heavy. And I imagine a lot of you out there are running funds or wanting to run funds or LPs and probably have very specific questions. So either type them in the chat. There we go. We're already starting to get some. So Sumar, so with Alliance X, one of the CVCs, wants to know, is there a certain threshold for VC funds in terms of committed capital above which they're obliged to be classified as an Article 8 fund?
Yes. No, so there's not a limit when it comes to how much you manage. The like what defines if you are in Article 8 or Article 9 or Article 6 is actually how you choose to classify the fund. So it's really about, if you choose to say, okay, we are having sustainable investments as an objective, then you are Article 9. If you say, okay, we don't consider sustainability factors at all, then you are probably ending up in an Article 6. So it's very much on how we set up the fund and the objective.
Would it be relevant with the CVC if they're not marketing themselves, so they can just focus on being a sustainability fund, but have less kind of reporting requirements?
Yeah, so many of these requirements, they kick in if you market yourself in the EU. So if you're not marketing or not offering it, or at least not marketing it in the EU, then many of these requirements will not be relevant either.
Understood. And Manuela wants to know, is the difference for Article 8 and Article 9 just the evaluation with social KPIs?
No, so there's actually a much bigger difference there, which is that when the Article 9 they need to have an objective of investing 100% with a sustainable investment objective. And what that means in practice is that 100% of the investments must have a sustainable investment objective. And how that is defined is like, what is a sustainable investment objective and what is a sustainable investments? Like, you need to have 100% sustainable investments. That's actually up to the fund manager to define like this, what is a sustainable investment. That's also what making it a bit extra tricky. I think like some of these questions here, we could probably provide an own webinar on, because they're quite tricky when it comes to this definition of sustainable investment, which really goes into the core of Article 9, which is not really clearly defined from the EU side. The EU says that it's up to the fund manager to define what's a sustainable investment and setting the thresholds and the do no significant harm thresholds for a sustainable investment.
Let's say someone wants to reach out to you and get more technical advice on that. What's the email, Anders? Yes,
so you can just, I will have it actually on the last slide here. I can just here. So this is my email, anders.pavlestad@celsia.io. Please feel free to reach out. I can also add to that if you're doing taxonomy aligned, like 100% taxonomy aligned investments, then it's a kind of a safe harbor. We can say that is a sustainable investment per definition. Because again, just to make it a bit extra tricky, like the definition of sustainable investment under the SFDR is not then 100% overlapping with investment in the taxonomy. In the taxonomy, you say, okay, if you are taxonomy aligned, you're sustainable. In the SFDR, you say, okay, it's up to the fund manager to define what is a sustainable investment, what is the limit. But it kind of goes the other way, that if you are a fund manager and say, okay, I make a taxonomy aligned investment, then you can say, okay, that's per definition sustainable.
Interesting. Any other questions, folks, or any common mistakes or misunderstandings, Anders?
Yeah, I think just to round off, I think that yes, this might seem quite tricky when at the first glance, but I think our experience is that when starting to work with it in practice, it's not as tricky as it might seem. And it has, as we touched a bit upon, and it's also a bit on this slide, there are some clear benefits, I think, both to investors and also the portfolio companies in many cases of doing it. So I would very much encourage everyone to go a bit deeper into taxonomy screening.
And two more, where should startups go to look up their taxonomy activities?
Yeah, so the simplest way I would say is using the taxonomy compass. So if you just Google that, you will find a compass with an overview of all the activities that are currently in force in the taxonomy. So that would be kind of the first stop, I think, to see if you have any taxonomy activities. When we work with companies, we usually do this for them. So we do a first screening of the whole portfolio, and then can tell quite quickly which companies that are most likely performing taxonomy activities and not. But taxonomy compass is also a completely defined source.
And then another question we got here: do you expect the SFDR categories and requirements will get adjusted in the coming years as the first reports are published this year?
Yes, I think, or it's a bit uncertain if how much it will be adjusted, but I think at least there will become some more clarifications at some point, because now we see there's a lot of open questions, not necessarily too much on what I covered today, which has to do with taxonomy disclosures, but on all the other parts of the SFDR, as I touched a bit upon with this definition of sustainable investments and so on. And also, I think the categorization of Article 8 and 9, I think there will probably be some more clarifications from the Commission side quite soon. We see it already now from the latest platform report and the consultation paper that, yes, probably will be some adjustments.
Any last questions, folks? All things EU Fund Taxonomy, you got probably the expert in the world, or one of them, since you guys are, I think, the main player in town when it comes to getting rid of the paperwork for this. Again, if you guys want to check out Celsia and what they're doing for your fund, potentially 20% discount if you go to forward.vc/Celsia, that's CELSIA, and just tell them we sent you. If you don't, you can pay the full price. That's fine too. But we hope this has been helpful for you guys. I know it's a very heavy topic, but it's also a very important and relevant topic now, as more and more funds are trying to get certified and hits that Article 8, Article 9 status, and ideally attract more investment dollars and LPs into the space. If you want to subscribe, you can subscribe on Eventbrite. We do these events 2 to 4 times a month. We've got our Startup Tank events as well. It's just forward.vc/Eventbrite. We've got a climate VC database with 1,000+ funds, incubators, accelerators, and CVCs focused on climate and clean tech. That's just forward.vc/VC database. And our Climate Techies community is a great way to connect with 4,000 or so folks in Slack, WhatsApp, founders, funders, VCs, corporates, government agencies. You want to connect with everybody in the space and get all the stakeholders involved, forward.vc/techies. And you can find everybody there, reach out, network, and hopefully find some relevant investments, etc. Thanks, Anders. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in.
Thanks for having me, Mats. It's been a pleasure.
Sweet, guys. Have a great one. Cheers.